correct.
And you cannot obey the one another commands, comfort one another, edify one another, love one another, look out for one another. There's literally dozens of one another commands in the Scriptures unless you know the people.
That's right.
And how do you get to know the people? And we've said this before, staring at the back of someone's head. Okay, now what about some evidence from outside of Scripture and outside of logical arguments?
Well, it's interesting. All scholars agree that the early church met in the home. One time I went through and started looking up some. I found a Catholic named Philip Hughes who said very clearly the early church met in homes. This is not even debated. It's a slam dunk. The early church met in homes. Early Christians, in fact, were called atheists because they didn't have temple buildings for their gods like all the other religions. And someone would look at a Christian and say, well, where's your church? Where's your temple? And they say, we don't have a temple. Well, you must be an atheist. You don't have anywhere for your God to live. He's homeless. You've got a homeless God. A good quote, there's a good book by a man named Graydon F. Snyder, who's not an evangelical Christian, but he's an archaeologist. And it's called Archaeological Evidence of Church Life Before Constantine. And I pulled a quote from there, and here it is. There is no literary evidence nor archaeological indication that any home was converted into an extant church building, nor is there any extant church that certainly was built prior to Constantine. Consequently, we have no evidence regarding the intentional structure of a Christian meeting place prior to the peace. The peace is 312 when Constantine tolerated the religion of Christianity. And that's very fancy scholarly language, sometimes hard to interpret. But no church buildings, we can't find any. They don't exist before 300.
Now, there is some archaeological evidence. They have found, for instance, in some of the Jewish cities in Israel, where they have the ancient symbol for Christians, the fish, and where they have it in Jewish homes, where they have all the practices of Judaism, all the stuff they use for the Sabbath and all the rest of that, and then all of a sudden they show an increase, like for instance, in the number of plates or the number of bowls or the number of cups or the so that they do have archaeological evidence of people meeting in homes. Now, since they didn't have an altar or a Eucharist or a chalice or a robe, there's no physical archaeological evidence that those meetings were church meetings. But there is evidence in some of those houses that have been covered that the inhabitants were Christians and that they had groups of people in their homes.
That's right.
Lots of stuff there. All right, let's go to the naysayers. Objection number one. Dan, it just doesn't make any difference where we meet. It's what goes on at the meeting that matters.
Well, I would say, first of all, that as a matter of fact, it does make a difference psychologically where you meet. And when people ask me this, I ask a question, okay, well, if it doesn't make any difference where you meet, would you like to take your church into a strip joint that's been closed down on Sunday because they can't strip on Sunday, so they'll rent you the building? Why don't you just rent that building and go in there? As a matter of fact, one time I did meet in a bar up in Chicago in a church that met in a bar that was shut down on Sunday, and I'm telling you, it did affect the atmosphere. It just has to. Restaurants care about ambience. How would you like to take your wife out to eat a $50 steak on your anniversary in the emergency room of a hospital with all the triage going on? I mean, an architect would absolutely laugh at the statement that a building doesn't affect us. I remember one time I went into a bank and I was talking to a loan officer. I wasn't trying to get a loan, but I had to talk to him about something else. And he asked me to sit down, and I was at the end of this long table, and he was at one end, and I sat down at the other end, and my neck came to the edge of the table as my rear end sank very, very low. And I realized that this seating arrangement was affecting me psychologically. I knew who the head was, and I knew who the tail was.
Right.
I mean, our physical bodies affect the way we feel. You feel differently when you're prostrate on your face than when you're standing up shaking your fist up in the air. I mean, that's just the way we are as human beings. And the way we meet will affect you psychologically. You get in one of these, I've been through a bunch of cathedrals in France, and you get into one of those big cathedrals, it will take your breath away, and then it will affect your emotions almost immediately, unless you're hard as a rock.
Right.
So I do believe it makes a difference, and I believe the home creates psychological responses that are much more conducive to the proper relationship of a spiritual family than when you meet in an institutional building.
Yeah. Objection number two. there are reasons the early church met in homes that don't apply today.
Well, an aspect of that objection is this. Believers were too poor to build buildings back then. Believers today have money, and therefore we're free to build buildings, whereas they couldn't back then. Well, the answer to that's very easy. That ancient people, no matter how poor they were able to build buildings, and in fact have done so all throughout human history. For example, you can look at pagans who were just as poor as Christians. They built the Temple of Artemis of the Ephesians, which was one of the ancient wonders of the world. In fact, the remains are still there in Turkey if you want to go see them. The Jews were generally poor. Everybody was poor back then. I mean, that's just the way society was. Capitalism hadn't developed yet, and yet temples and synagogues popped up everywhere. It wasn't because that Christians didn't have the money that they didn't build buildings. They didn't want to build buildings.
Right. All right. What about the idea that the only reason, it wasn't that they were poor, the reason they met in homes is because they were trying to duck persecution?
Well, right, as I mentioned earlier, of course, persecution doesn't really stop you from meeting in homes doesn't stop persecution from getting you, as Paul proved in Acts chapter 8. But let's point out something here, that it is a myth that any kind of persecution drove believers into their homes. Let's start with Roman persecution. We have an idea in our mind because of Nero and because of the movies we watch and because of the Fox's Book of Martyrs and so forth, that persecution was an ongoing thing from the time of Christ to the time of Constantine. But as a matter of fact, during those 300 years, the persecution was sporadic as far as time is concerned, and it was scattered as far as geography is concerned. And that has been proven by especially modern scholarship. I've got a bunch of scholarly quotations, which I won't bore you with reading, but it's been proven beyond a shadow of a doubt. And myths die hard. It's hard for people to realize that most of the time, for 300 years, in most places in the Roman Empire, the church was not under persecution, and yet during that whole time, the Christians did meet in homes.
All right. Now, you made a point earlier, it would be good to mention it again, is that going into the houses does not stop persecution.
That's right. Well, in China, you have the biggest house church, the biggest and fastest growing church in the world is in China right now, and they all meet in homes. In fact, I was just reading one of their apostles who said, we plan to spread the gospel through the western border of China, and we do not plan on building one church building. He said the world has plenty of church buildings. We don't need any more, to which I concur completely. And but they're being persecuted terribly. Meeting in homes does not stop persecution.
All right. Now, that takes care of the Roman persecution. What about the Jewish persecution?
Well, the Jews stopped persecuting the Christians after AD 70 when the temple was destroyed, and the Christians met in homes between AD 30 to AD 300. So that's about 230 years of meeting in homes with no Jewish persecution and only scattered Roman persecution. So you see, the church met in homes for a period of time longer than America has been a republic.
All right. Now, another objection that falls under that early objection is this idea that that's the way they began, but there's nothing that prohibits us from growing. You call it in your notes the progressive ecclesiology argument.
Right. That's the similar argument used by religious liberals who don't like any kind of standard for any time that transcends all time and places. They say, for example, we like to grow and mature about our attitudes towards homosexuality.
Yeah.
Things are different today than they were back then. And so I really don't like this argument for a lot of reasons. But the last time the church grew in the church buildings was when Constantine provided a lot of pagan temples for the Christians when he made Christianity the Roman state religion. And I don't consider that an advance. I consider that a retrograde movement when Constantine did that. I think that most Christians today, at least lots of Christians today, think that the Constantine experiment was a disaster. So I don't believe in that kind of growth. I like the apostolic standard. I'd much rather do things the way the apostles did, and I don't want to grow past the apostles. I think they're plenty grown up enough for me.
You make an interesting point in your notes that they had 300 years to grow into church buildings, and that's longer than the United States has been a republic.
That's right.
Yeah.
And they didn't grow. They just stagnated in those homes. It's terrible.
All right. Playing the devil's advocate still, objection number 3. What about all the other places besides homes that the New Testament Christians met? And therefore, the argument that the biblical pattern is not just houses, but also temples and whatnot.
I referred to this earlier in the broadcast. the argument that's most often used is, well, see, they met from house to house and in the temple, and the Christians met in the temple, and therefore, see, we can have buildings. And there's a big jump going from temple to Christian religious buildings, and so I'd like to examine that argument pretty carefully.
Let's do it.
Okay, well, first of all, we need to make clear that when we're talking about the biblical home church, we are not opposed to evangelism, teaching, healing, all kinds of ministry or work-type activities happening in buildings. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with an evangelist going out and renting a big football stadium and having an evangelistic meeting there, because that's the work. That's not the church. I don't want to have church in a football stadium, but I don't care if evangelism goes on there.
All right, now let's make this point completely clear, because some of us, the listening audience, may have missed the first three programs. The work of the church as opposed to the meeting of the church.
Two different things, two different functions. The purpose of the function of the church is to mutually edify the believers, make them grow up in Christ, make them mature up into the head, whereas the work of the church is to go out and start more churches, to strengthen churches, and to spread the kingdom.
All right, so churches met in houses. Evangelism took place everywhere, temples, synagogues, in the street, in the marketplace, everywhere.
That's right.
Okay, go ahead.
All right, well, first of all, we need to show that it was not church functions that were going on in the temple. It was public ministry work that was going on, evangelism, basically. And let me try to do this real quickly. If we look at Acts 2:46, we see the phrase, we see this verse, and day by day, continuing with one mind in the temple. Within the very next verse, in verse 47, we see that they were evangelizing in the temple, because that verse says, and the Lord was adding to their number day by day those who were being saved. Day by day they were meeting in the temple, and day by day people were getting saved. So what the meetings were for was for evangelism. We can go to Acts chapter 3, verse 1, and that chapter says this, now Peter and John were going up to the temple at the 9th hour, and while he, the man who was formerly lame, was clinging to Peter and John, all the people ran together to them at the so-called portico of Solomon, full of amazement. Now this is obviously a healing work done in pursuit of evangelism, and in fact, Peter, in his Pentecostal sermon in verses 12 through 26 of that chapter, is preaching evangelism the whole way. So we see there that when Peter and John are in the temple, they weren't there going to church. They were there evangelizing. So you can't use that verse to say that the early church met in the temple. And then Acts 5 is where most of these verses are, where the naysayers refer to. Acts chapter 5, verse 12, and they were all with one accord in Solomon's portico. Now, it's sort of ambiguous as to what they were doing there, but you can tell by looking at the context of what they were doing was evangelism, because right in the same verse, at the first half of the verse, it mentioned signs and wonders that the apostles were doing, and of course signs and wonders are the classic tools of evangelism.
Well, now let me make that point as we slide past. I was going to make it on the last verse, but now that you've done it twice, let me bring it forward.
All right.
It's amazing to me how you don't find any quote-unquote healing ministries in the New Testament.
Mm-hmm.
What you find is men preaching the gospel, and when the gospel is preached, God manifested himself through signs and wonders.
That's correct.
And I think we've got it backwards, particularly in our country, where we have the big tent healers and all the rest of it. Does God heal his people? Yes. I mean, I believe in the gift of healing for today. But it seems to me the emphasis is wrong. I think we're supposed to go out where a whole bunch of pagans are and tell them about the good news of Jesus Christ, and these signs shall follow them that believe.
That's right.
But anyway, go ahead. Didn't mean to interrupt your flow here.
All right. And then in the same chapter, Acts 5, verse 21, Luke says this, and upon hearing this, they entered into the temple about daybreak and began to teach. And so people might say, aha, see, they're teaching in the temple. That's what people do in church. They teach, therefore there's a church meeting. But, and the word teach is somewhat ambiguous. However, if you look at the context there of verse 21, you will see that it's evangelism going on. For example, back up a few verses in verses 12 through 16, we see this, and by the hands of the apostles were many signs and wonders wrought among the people. Again, evangelism. Verse 18, the authorities threw the apostle in jail. They weren't concerned about internal doctrinal discussions amongst the church. They were concerned because the apostles were spreading the gospel all over the place and causing uproar. So it was evangelism that this chapter is concerned about. And then in verse 20, which is getting real close to the immediate context, an angel appears to the apostles in jail and says, speak to the people in the temple the message of this life. In other words, evangelize these guys in the temple. So, and also in verse 21, it says that the apostles answered the angel by entering into the temple, and they began to teach, which of course means to evangelize. And last but not least, in Acts chapter 5, verse 42, the verse says this, and daily in the temple and in every house they cease not to teach and preach. And the word preach there is evangelizomai, the Greek word for preach. And so it's obvious that the whole chapter is dealing with evangelism. It is not dealing with meeting in a church.
Well, let me ask you this, Dan. Would you be comfortable preaching in a synagogue or in the temple today?
Preaching in the sense of evangelizing?
Yes.
If somebody was willing to listen, sure.
Would you be comfortable with preaching, evangelizing in a institutional church building?
Well, I think preaching and evangelizing should be done anywhere where somebody's willing to listen.
There you go. Okay. Now, the church, when it meets, though, meets in that small, intimate, family-style group for the purpose of edifying, not evangelizing.
That's right.
All right, go ahead. I just wanted our audience to make sure that. Listen, if some Catholic priest invited me to a mass and said I could evangelize, I'd go on a New York minute.
Sure, but you wouldn't want to have your weekly church meeting in.
No, heavens, no.
Yeah.
No, heavens, no.
Right.
But anyway, I still haven't gotten an invitation to go preach at a Catholic mass, so it's not going to happen. So.
Yeah, right. But you know, Mike, going along with this temple argument, even if the meetings were church meetings that were happening in the temple, the meetings weren't really in the temple.
Yeah.
They were in the temple court. Because why couldn't they be in the temple? Because inside the temple there were bloody sacrifices going on, and Jesus died to get rid of those bloody sacrifices.
That's right.
Yeah. So the temple is a horrible example to put that up as a New Testament pattern, and we should follow today. Oh, yeah, let's go have a church building because they had a temple back then. That temple was not owned by Christians; it was owned by Jews. It was owned by the Jews who had set up that Jewish system that crucified Jesus.
Correct.
So that is so far away from being a church building, it's not even funny.
All right. Now, we're coming close to the end of our time, Dan. We got about 3 minutes left. I guess what I want you to do is I want you to summarize see, to me, what made sense to me when I first started looking at this is that the house church best described or best expressed the heart of God towards his people. Mm-hmm. And there are some people who will listen to everything that we said today and said we're just a bunch of legalists, you have to meet in the house, blah, 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 blah. And I really think it's important that they understand the purpose, and it's hard to represent God's purposes because they're so many and so varied and so many of the things he does. But, and I hate to sound like a redundant recording over and over and over again, but it's relationship. Mm-hmm. And your thoughts on that?
Well, what's the best place to work out your relationships but in your home with your spiritual brothers and sisters?
Yeah. Is a house church, the relationship aspect of it, is it easier in a small group or in a big group?
Well, it's not really possible in a big group. It's hard to do, like you say, to do all that one another and to mutually encourage one another. If you've got 300 people, you can't even see them or don't even know who they are.
Yeah.
How many times have you heard people say, "Well, I went to church and I saw so and so at church, but I don't know him. I didn't know who he was. I didn't recognize him." You know?
Right. Well, I had an interesting conversation. A fellow that I've been witnessing to for some time, very interested in the gospel, asked me today. He says, "Well, how big should a house church be?" And I said, "Well, how good are you at relationships?" And he said that he was relationship retarded. And he said, if it's on the basis of the ability to function in relationships, then I'll probably need to belong to a house church of about 2 or 3 people.
Well, you know,
but it's true. It's harder, isn't it, Dan?
It's very hard. A lot of people ask me, too. I've had this question come up. Well, how big is too big? How big should your house church be? And, of course, there's no set number. But what I always say was as soon as you find out that you can't maintain intimate relationships with people, it's time for you to seek other arrangements, to start another one or to separate or do something. Because if you can't do that, what's the point of going to church?
That's right. Amen to that. All right. We did not get through today's notes. You good for one more Saturday?
I am.
Good. And we want to invite the people again, the 11th Annual Southern House Church Conference, May 21st to the 23rd. Dan will be one of the speakers. A bunch of other speakers will be there. You can get that information at ntrf.org. Just go to the events or activities button. Everything you'd want to know is there. Got about 20 seconds, Dan. Why don't you tell the people goodbye and bless them?
Goodbye, everybody. Bless you very much.
All right. Thanks all of y'all for listening. We'll see you next week.